Have you ever found yourself trapped in an emotional web, so tangled that you couldn't see where you ended and another person began? Maybe it's that ex who still occupies your thoughts months after the breakup, or a toxic friend whose moods dictate your entire day, or perhaps a family member whose approval you desperately seek, despite knowing they'll never give it. If you're nodding along, you're not alone. We've all been there, caught in the suffocating grip of emotional attachment that drains our energy, clouds our judgment, and keeps us from becoming who we're truly meant to be. What if I told you that one of history's most brilliant minds had already mapped out the exact blueprint for breaking free from these emotional chains? Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, didn't just theorize about emotional freedom. He lived it, breathed it, and developed practical wisdom that can transform your life today. Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." This isn't just a pretty quote to share on social media. It's a profound truth that holds the key to emotional liberation. You see, most of us approach detachment all wrong. We think it means becoming cold, shutting down, or simply walking away. But Jung understood something deeper. True emotional detachment isn't about building walls. It's about understanding why we built them in the first place. In the next few minutes, I'm going to share with you Jung's 10 most powerful principles for achieving emotional detachment, but not the kind that leaves you empty and disconnected from life. Instead, you'll discover how to detach in a way that actually makes you more alive, more authentic, and more capable of genuine connection. These aren't feel-good platitudes or quick fixes. They're time-tested psychological principles that have helped thousands of people reclaim their emotional sovereignty. But here's what makes this different from every other self-help advice you've heard. Jung didn't just study the mind from the outside. He dove deep into his own psyche, confronted his own demons, and emerged with insights that most people spend their entire lives trying to understand. He knew that the path to emotional freedom requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to look at parts of ourselves we'd rather keep hidden. So if you're ready to stop being a prisoner of your own emotions, if you're tired of giving other people the power to control how you feel, and if you want to learn how to love without losing yourself in the process, then stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change not just how you relate to others, but how you relate to yourself. Jung believed that our greatest suffering comes not from external circumstances, but from our unconscious reactions to them. And once you understand these reactions, once you bring them into the light of consciousness, you gain the power to choose your response rather than being controlled by it. This is where true freedom begins. The first rule Jung would give us about emotional detachment might surprise you because it seems to go against everything we think we know about letting go. Jung understood that you cannot detach from what you refuse to acknowledge. He spent years studying what he called the shadow, those parts of ourselves we prefer to ignore or deny. When it comes to emotional attachment, our shadow often contains the very reasons we cling so desperately to others. Think about it. Why do you find it so hard to let go of someone who clearly isn't good for you? Why do you keep checking their social media, replaying conversations, or hoping they'll change? Jung would say, it's because there's something in your unconscious that this person represents or fulfills. Maybe they mirror a part of you that feels unworthy of love, so you keep trying to earn their affection to prove your worth. Maybe they remind you of a parent who withheld approval, and you're still trying to resolve that childhood wound through this relationship. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This darkness isn't evil. It's simply the parts of our psyche we haven't fully integrated. When we're emotionally attached to someone in an unhealthy way, they often become a projection screen for our unconscious material. So the first step toward emotional detachment is radical self-honesty. You need to ask yourself the uncomfortable questions. What does this person represent to me? What am I really trying to get from them? What would I have to face about myself if I truly let them go? This isn't about self-blame or judgment. It's about understanding the psychological dynamics at play, so you can address them at their source. I once worked with a woman who couldn't detach from her ex-boyfriend, despite him treating her poorly for years. Through exploring her shadow, she realized he represented her father's emotional unavailability. She wasn't really attached to him. She was attached to the familiar pattern of trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it. Once she saw this clearly, the attachment began to dissolve. naturally, because she understood it was never really about him at all. This brings us to Jung's second principle, understanding projection. Jung discovered that much of what we think we see in others is actually a reflection of our own unconscious content. He called this projection, and it's one of the most powerful forces keeping us emotionally entangled with others. When you're deeply attached to someone, you're often not seeing them clearly. Instead, you're seeing your projections, your hopes, fears, needs, and unconscious patterns superimposed onto them. You might be in love with your idea of who they could become, or you might be repulsed by qualities in them that you haven't accepted in yourself. Jung observed, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This is projection in action. That person who triggers you so much, they're probably showing you something about yourself you'd rather not see. The person you can't stop thinking about, they might be carrying projections of your unlived potential or unmet needs. The key to emotional detachment through understanding projection is learning to withdraw these projections consciously. This means asking yourself, what am I seeing in this person that might actually be coming from me? What qualities am I attributing to them that might be my own unconscious material? What do I need from them that I could potentially give to myself? This process isn't about dismissing your feelings or pretending the other person doesn't have their own qualities. It's about separating what's actually them from what's your projection. When you can do this, something magical happens. You start relating to them as they actually are, rather than as your psyche needs them to be. This naturally creates healthy emotional distance, because you're no longer using them to complete yourself psychologically. Jung's third principle for emotional detachment involves what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who others expect you to be. Many of our unhealthy attachments stem from a lack of individual identity. We attach to others because we don't have a strong sense of self to stand on. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this journey of becoming yourself requires separating from the collective expectations, family patterns, and social roles that have shaped your identity. It means discovering your own values, desires, and purposes rather than living through others or seeking constant validation from them. When you're emotionally attached to someone in an unhealthy way, you've often lost touch with your own center. You might find yourself constantly wondering what they're thinking, adjusting your behavior to please them, or feeling incomplete without their attention. This is a sign that you've abandoned your own psychological ground and are trying to find stability through the relationship. The path to detachment through individuation involves reclaiming your own life. This means rediscovering your interests, values, and goals independent of this person. It means learning to validate yourself rather than seeking constant approval from them. It means building a life so rich and meaningful that no single relationship can make or break your sense of well-being. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or uncaring. In fact, Jung believed that only when we become truly individual can we genuinely relate to others. When you're secure in your own identity, you can love others without needing to possess them or complete yourself through them. This creates the foundation for healthy relationships and makes emotional detachment possible when necessary. The fourth principle Jung would emphasize is accepting the reality of the other person rather than fighting against it. Much of our emotional suffering comes from what Jung called resistance to what is. We become attached to our ideas of how someone should be rather than accepting how they actually are. Jung understood that acceptance doesn't mean approval or resignation. It means seeing clearly without the distortion of wishful thinking. When you're emotionally attached to someone who isn't good for you, you're often attached to their potential rather than their reality. You keep hoping they'll change, grow, or suddenly become the person you need them to be. This hope becomes a prison because it keeps you emotionally invested in an outcome you can't control. Jung would say that this resistance to reality is a form of unconscious inflation, believing you have the power to change or control another person's essential nature. This inflation keeps you trapped in cycles of disappointment and resentment. True emotional detachment requires what Jung called radical acceptance. This means seeing the person clearly, acknowledging their limitations and patterns, and releasing your attachment to them being different. It doesn't mean you have to stay in relationship with them, but it means you stop fighting against the reality of who they are. When you can accept someone fully as they are, including their capacity for change or lack thereof, you naturally begin to detach from unrealistic expectations. You start making decisions based on reality rather than hope. and you free yourself from the exhausting cycle of trying to transform someone else. Jung's fifth principle focuses on what he called holding the tension of opposites. In any relationship, especially one you're trying to detach from, you'll experience conflicting emotions. You might love someone and also feel angry with them. You might want to be close to them and also need to create distance. You might appreciate their good qualities while also recognizing their harmful patterns. Most people try to resolve this tension by choosing one side or the other. They either idealize the person and ignore their flaws, or they demonize them and deny any positive feelings. Jung understood that this splitting is actually what keeps us psychologically entangled. When we can't hold the full complexity of our feelings, we remain reactive rather than responsive. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. This includes accepting the complexity of your feelings toward others. You can love someone and still choose to limit contact with them. You can appreciate their positive qualities while also protecting yourself from their destructive patterns. You can feel grateful for what they taught you while also acknowledging the pain they caused." This ability to hold opposing truths creates what Jung called the transcendent function, a capacity to move beyond either-or thinking into a more mature, integrated perspective. When you can hold the tension of loving someone while also needing to detach from them, you're no longer driven by the compulsion to resolve the contradiction. This internal spaciousness naturally creates external distance. The sixth principle involves understanding what Jung called the psychology of the transference. In any intense relationship, we often transfer onto the other person feelings and patterns from our past, particularly from our earliest relationships. These transferences can create incredibly powerful emotional bonds that have little to do with the present reality of the relationship. Jung discovered that much of what we call love is actually transference, unconscious projections from our childhood relationships onto current partners. We might be trying to heal old wounds, complete unfinished business, or recreate familiar patterns with someone who reminds us unconsciously of significant figures from our past. When you find yourself unable to detach from someone, despite clear evidence that the relationship isn't healthy, Jung would encourage you to explore what transference might be operating. Are you trying to get from this person what you never received from a parent? Are you attempting to resolve childhood dynamics through this adult relationship? Are you repeating patterns that feel familiar even when they're painful? Understanding transference doesn't minimize your feelings, but it helps you see them in context. When you realize that some of your intense attachment stems from unresolved issues from your past rather than the current relationship, you can begin to address those issues directly. This often significantly reduces the emotional charge around the current person and makes detachment much more possible. Jung believed that recognizing transference was essential for psychological development because it allows us to reclaim our own psychological material rather than projecting it onto others. When you stop using relationships to heal your past, you become free to engage with people as they are in the present. The seventh principle Jung would emphasize is the importance of what he called active imagination in the process of emotional detachment. Active imagination is a technique Jung developed to dialogue with unconscious content through imagery, fantasy, and creative expression. It's a way of working directly with your psyche to understand and integrate difficult emotions. When you're struggling to detach from someone, part of the difficulty often lies in unconscious material that isn't accessible through rational thinking alone. You might understand intellectually why you need to let go, but emotionally you feel stuck. This is where active imagination can be incredibly helpful. Jung would encourage you to engage imaginatively with your attachment. You might visualize conversations with the person, imagine different scenarios, or even dialogue with the part of yourself that's holding on. Through this process, you can often discover hidden fears, unmet needs, or unconscious beliefs that are keeping you emotionally entangled. For example, you might discover through active imagination that you're terrified of being alone, so you cling to relationships even when they're unhealthy. Or you might realize that you believe you're only worthy of love if you can fix or save someone else. These insights, gained through working with your unconscious, can be more transformative than any amount of logical analysis. Active imagination also allows you to practice detachment in your inner world. Before implementing it in external reality, you can imagine yourself responding differently to the person, setting boundaries, or walking away with dignity. This internal rehearsal makes it easier to act from a place of conscious choice, rather than unconscious reaction when you encounter them in real life. Jung's eighth principle involves what he called the reality of the psyche. Jung understood that our internal psychological reality is just as real and important as external circumstances. When you're trying to detach from someone, you need to work with your psyche as seriously as you would work with any other aspect of reality. Means recognizing that emotional detachment isn't just a matter of changing your behavior or avoiding someone. It requires genuine psychological transformation. Your psyche has reasons for creating these attachments, and those reasons need to be understood and addressed with compassion and patience. Jung would say that forcing yourself to detach without understanding the psychological dynamics involved is like trying to uproot a tree without knowing how deep its roots go. You might succeed temporarily, but the attachment will likely resurface in some form because you haven't addressed its psychological foundation. Working with the reality of your psyche means taking your dreams seriously, paying attention to your fantasies and daydreams about the person, noticing your physical reactions when you think about them, and exploring the symbolic meaning of your attachment. It means treating your unconscious as a valuable source of information rather than something to be ignored or overridden. This psychological approach to detachment is slower than simply cutting someone off, but it's more thorough and lasting. When you understand and integrate the psychological material that created the attachment, you naturally begin to detach because the unconscious compulsion is resolved. The ninth principle Jung would emphasize is the importance of finding meaning in your suffering. Jung believed that suffering becomes unbearable only when it seems meaningless. When you can find meaning in your struggle to detach from someone, the process becomes not just bearable, but transformative. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Part of accepting yourself completely involves accepting your capacity for attachment, even unhealthy attachment, as part of your humanity, rather than judging yourself for being unable to let go easily. You can see this struggle as meaningful information about your psyche. Your difficulty in detaching might be teaching you about your need for independence, your patterns in relationships, your unhealed wounds, or your capacity for love. It might be forcing you to develop qualities like patience, self-compassion, or inner strength that you wouldn't develop otherwise. It might be preparing you for a different kind of relationship in the future. When you can frame your struggle with attachment as meaningful rather than just painful, you approach it with curiosity rather than resistance. This shift in perspective often makes the actual detachment process easier, because you're no longer fighting against your experience but learning from it. Jung believed that every psychological difficulty contains the seeds of growth, if we're willing to engage with it consciously. Your struggle to detach from someone might be exactly the challenge your psyche needs to develop greater maturity, wisdom, and authentic relatedness. The 10th and final principle Jung would offer is what he called the reality of psychological time. Jung understood that the psyche operates on its own timeline, which is often different from our conscious desires or external pressures. Emotional detachment, especially from significant relationships, rarely happens according to our preferred schedule. Jung would remind you that trying to force detachment often backfires because it creates internal resistance. The part of you that's attached needs time to understand, integrate, and release. This process can't be rushed without risking psychological damage or ensuring that the pattern will repeat in future relationships. This doesn't mean you should be passive or wait indefinitely. It means you should work actively with your psyche while accepting that the process unfolds in its own time. You can engage in therapy, practice self-reflection, set boundaries, and take care of yourself while allowing the deeper psychological transformation to happen at its own pace. Jung also understood that detachment often happens in layers rather than all at once. You might feel like you've let go completely, only to discover another level of attachment that needs attention. This isn't failure. It's the natural process of deep psychological change. Understanding psychological time helps you approach detachment with patience and self-compassion rather than self-criticism and impatience. It helps you trust the process, even when it doesn't unfold as quickly or smoothly as you'd like. As we come to the end of our exploration of Jung's principles for emotional detachment, it's important to remember that detachment, in Jung's understanding, isn't about becoming emotionally unavailable or disconnected from life. It's about developing what he called conscious relatedness, the ability to engage with others from a place of choice rather than compulsion. wholeness rather than neediness, and genuine care rather than unconscious projection. Jung believed that our capacity for healthy relationships depends on our relationship with ourselves. When we're secure in our own identity, comfortable with our own company, and committed to our own growth, we naturally relate to others in healthier ways. We can love without losing ourselves, care without controlling, and let go when necessary, without feeling destroyed. The journey of emotional detachment, as Jung understood it, is ultimately a journey towards psychological freedom and authentic selfhood. It's about reclaiming your power to choose your responses rather than being controlled by unconscious reactions. It's about learning to love in a way that honors both your own needs and the reality of others. This process isn't easy, and it isn't quick, but it's one of the most worthwhile journeys you can undertake because it leads not just to freedom from unhealthy attachments, but to the capacity for relationships that truly nourish and support your highest development. Remember, Jung spent his entire life studying the human psyche, and he discovered that our greatest challenges often contain our greatest opportunities for growth. Your struggle with emotional attachment isn't a weakness or failure. It's a doorway to deeper self-understanding and more authentic living. As Jung himself wrote, your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens. The path to emotional detachment begins with this inward journey, this willingness to awaken to the truth of your own psyche and the patterns that have shaped your relationships. Take these principles not as rules to follow rigidly, but as invitations to explore your own psychological landscape with curiosity and compassion. Your journey toward emotional freedom will be unique to you, but these timeless insights from one of psychology's greatest minds can serve as a reliable compass along the way. The freedom you seek isn't found in avoiding attachment altogether, but in developing the wisdom to attach consciously and the strength to detach when love requires it. This is the gift Jung offers us, not just the ability to let go, but the capacity to love more deeply and authentically than we ever thought possible.